The morning hung heavy over Dry Creek town, a sky the color of unpolished lead, clouds crouched low like beasts waiting to strike. The air still reeked of gunpowder and sweat. A rope swung slow and silent from the old mesquite tree at the edge of town, creaking against the wind like a guilty whisper. The outlaw's boots dangled a few inches from the dirt. No music from the saloon, no murmurs from the crowd that had watched him swing. Just silence, the kind that settles after judgment's already been passed. Marshal Dane Holt rode in from the northern ridge, dust and rain clinging to his duster. His horse snorted hard, sensing the stillness. Holt had chased that man, Wade Vance, across 3 counties. Stagecoaches burned, farmers robbed, 2 deputies left bleeding in the dust. Holt thought this morning would bring peace, the kind of grim, quiet peace a noose delivers. But the sight waiting under that hanging tree said otherwise. There, kneeling in the mud beneath the body, was a young woman, face streaked with ash and tears, her dark hair tangled in the wind. In her hands, she cradled the outlaw's worn boots like they were a child's keepsake. Her voice, cracked but steady, cut through the cold air. "Don't touch him," she whispered, when the marshal dismounted. He wasn't all bad. Holt froze mid-step. His eyes narrowed, studying her, the set of her jaw, the familiar sharpness around her cheekbones. He'd seen that face before, in wanted posters, in the corner of his guilt. "You're his kin," he said quietly. She looked up at him, eyes blazing through the grief. "I'm his sister." Before he could answer, a sharp echo ripped through the hills, a rifle's report splitting the morning like thunder. The hanging rope snapped and hissed, splinters flying as a bullet buried itself in the tree trunk inches from Holt's head. Horses screamed. A second shot kicked dirt near his boots. Without thinking, Holt lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm and throwing both of them behind the wagon ruts. Mud splashed, dust choked the air. He drew his revolver, scanning the ridgeline. Nothing but mist and silence. Then, a final whisper of wind carried through the canyon, faint and deliberate. A message from the hills. The Vance gang wasn't finished. Holt's grip tightened on the woman's wrist. "You're coming with me," he muttered, eyes fixed on the dark ridge ahead. "'Cause they're coming for you next." The wind carried the last sound of the swinging rope as it tore loose and hit the ground. A soft thud, like a sentence ending. The canyon wind howled like a wounded beast when Marshal Dane Holt reined his horse before the old line shack. Rain had started as a whisper, but now came down in angry sheets, drumming against the warped roof like fists. The cabin squatted at the edge of the gulch, half buried in mud and silence, the kind of place where even echoes seemed afraid to linger. Holt dismounted, boots sinking deep in the mire, then turned to the woman behind him, Clara Vance. Wrists bound, face pale beneath the grime. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, soaked through, the edges trembling in the wind. She didn't beg, didn't speak, just stared at the ground like she was listening for ghosts. Inside, the air was thick with old smoke and loneliness. A single table leaned crooked, one chair missing a leg. Holt tossed his hat aside, struck a match, and lit the rusted lantern hanging from a nail. Warm light spread over the walls, bullet scars, old stains, forgotten meals. He cut her bindings but kept his hand near his revolver. "Sit," he said. She obeyed, slow, deliberate. He poured her a tin cup of water. She didn't touch it. Instead, she stared at the fire he built, eyes flickering with something between grief and hatred. "You gonna tell me why you were at that hanging tree?" Holt asked. Her voice came soft but steady. "He was my brother." Silence. Just the hiss of rain and the groan of the old boards. Holt kept his gaze on the flames. "Then you know what he did." "The coach robbery outside Dead Rock. The passengers, she cut him off. He didn't kill those people." Her eyes rose to meet his, defiant, wet with anger. "You lawmen needed a body to hang. He was easy, poor, branded before he ever drew a gun." Holt's jaw tightened. "I saw that ambush myself, ma'am. I saw your brother's men drag a guard out into the dust. Don't preach innocence to me. And you shot him down like a dog anyway, didn't you?" She whispered. "That's the law's mercy?" The words landed heavy. Holt didn't answer. He just sat there, letting the fire throw shadows across his scarred face. The truth was, he hadn't meant to kill that horse. or the man who fell from it. But her brother's screams still haunted his nights. Outside, coyotes began to howl, long and mournful, like they knew the dead were listening. Clara turned her head toward the sound. "They always come when it rains," she said. "Makes the ground soft." He studied her, the tremor in her voice, the dirt beneath her nails, the raw defiance in her eyes. Something about her felt untamed, dangerous, yet honest in a way most people had long forgotten. "Get some rest," Holt muttered, standing. "You'll ride out at dawn," she laughed, dry, bitter. "Marshal, if you think there's a dawn left for either of us, you ain't been listening to the wind." He looked at her one last time before turning toward the door. The storm outside had grown fierce, rattling the shutters like bones in a drum. The Marshal closed them tight, but nothing could shut out what lingered between them. Mistrust, guilt, and the faint, uneasy notion that maybe neither of them was who they claimed to be. Morning crept over the canyon slow and colorless, a thin band of pale gold crawling up the ridges like the world was deciding whether to wake or not. The storm had passed, leaving behind the heavy scent of wet pine and wood smoke. Inside the cabin everything was damp, blankets, boots, and bones. Clara sat by the hearth, stirring the last of the ashes with a stick, her eyes hollow but calm, as if she'd burned through her grief and found only quiet left. Marshal Dane Holt moved carefully around her, patching the roof with strips of hide and splintered boards. Each hammer strike echoed like judgment through the still morning air. He'd been up since before dawn, working without a word. There was something in the silence between them. Not peace, not yet, but the first crack of it. Clara finally spoke, voice raw as the wind scraping stone. "Father died thinking the land was still ours," she said. "Banker took it with a smile and a paper I couldn't even read." She looked up at him, her eyes red but steady. "My brother? He swore he'd buy it back. He worked cattle, freight, even guarded stage lines. But there's no honest pay that can outpace a liar's pen." Holt paused mid-swing. The hammer stayed in his hand, motionless. "You're saying he turned outlaw for that?" Clara nodded slowly. "For that, and for me. I was 16. He couldn't let them throw us out into the dust." The Marshal set the hammer down. His jaw flexed, the weight of her words cutting deeper than he expected. He'd chased men across 4 territories for less. But something in her tone, the way she said "for me," stripped away the distance he'd built between right and wrong. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks of the walls like ghosts testing the seams. Holt moved closer to the fire, rubbing warmth back into his hands. That's when she noticed it, the thin white scar on his arm, half hidden beneath his sleeve. "That bullet mark," she said softly. "You got that from the Ambrose Canyon raid, didn't you?" He looked down at the wound as if seeing it for the first time. "Yeah, took it when I cut down your brother's horse." Her head turned sharply. "You?" "I didn't know who he was," Holt interrupted. "Didn't know a kid sister was watching from the ridge either. I was just doing what the badge told me to." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. She stared at him, breathing shallow. In that moment, she wasn't just looking at the man who'd captured her brother. She was staring at the law itself, cold and mechanical, standing before her in human shape. But when Holt finally met her eyes, the steel in him softened. "I thought I knew justice," he said quietly. "But lately I'm starting to wonder if I'd just been working for whoever owned the ink and the rope." The fire cracked, scattering tiny embers across the hearth. Clara reached for one with the stick, tracing shapes into the ash. "Letters maybe, names. These are the people who died when they came for us," she murmured. "Neighbors, farmhands, men who stood up." Her hand trembled, and for the first time Holt saw not the outlaw's sister, but a survivor writing history in dust. He crouched beside her, took the tin pot off the coals and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Not much left," he said, sliding one toward her. "But it's hot." She hesitated, staring at the rising steam. Then she took it, her fingers brushing his, a brief, almost accidental touch that said more than words could. They sat in silence again. The wind shifting outside, the smell of wet earth and burned rope filling the air. Somewhere beyond the gulch, a coyote cried out, a lonely broken sound that faded into nothing. Holt leaned back against the wall, the old boards creaking under his weight. For the first time since the hanging, he didn't feel like a marshal or a hunter. He felt human, flawed, uncertain, and sitting in the ashes with someone who had every reason to hate him, and maybe that was where trust began. Not with words, but with the quiet act of staying. The sun had begun to bleed into the canyon when Marshal Dane Holt saw it, thin spirals of grey rising from the distant ridge. Not the steady column of a ranch fire, not the lazy drift of a settler's cookpit. These were deliberate, measured, signals. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, one hand resting on the weathered frame, eyes narrowing against the dying light. The sky burned copper and red, the kind of color that warned of blood before morning. Behind him, Clara Vance was feeding the fire, her face half lit by orange glow. When she noticed his stare, she followed his gaze out toward the ridge. "Smoke," she murmured. "They're calling to each other." Holt nodded once. "They've found us." The wind carried the faint metallic tang of storm and gun oil. Every instinct in Holt's bones told him this wasn't just a warning. It was a hunt closing in. Moments later, hoofbeats, distant at first, then stumbling, frantic. Holt drew his revolver and stepped outside. A lone horse emerged from the tree line, its flanks slick with sweat and mud. The rider slumped forward, hat missing, uniform torn, a deputy from town. Holt caught him before he hit the dirt. "Marshal?" The man's lips were pale, breath shallow. "They're coming for her?" "Want her alive." Clara appeared in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. The deputy's eyes rolled back, then flared again with desperate light. "They said she knows where the silver's buried. Said they'll trade her for the body of her brother." His voice cracked like a snapped twig. "Said they'll be here by sunrise." Then he went still. For a moment, the only sound was the low hiss of the lantern beside them and the creak of the dying horse shifting in the mud. Holt lowered the deputy gently, covering his eyes with a gloved hand. The last of the light was fading, leaving only the wind, the whisper of pine, and the rising panic of what was coming. Inside, Clara's breath came fast. "He's lying," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know anything about silver." "I believe you," Holt said quietly. "But they won't." He looked around the small cabin, the half-patched roof, the weak door frame, the single rifle leaning by the hearth. It wasn't a fortress. It was a coffin waiting to be nailed shut. Clara straightened, her face pale but fierce. "Then what do we do?" Holt holstered his gun and met her eyes. "We make sure they regret finding this place." She swallowed hard, nodding once. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't when she spoke again. "Then you'd better let me fight beside you." For a long heartbeat, Holt just studied her, the outlaw's sister, the woman he'd once thought a threat, now standing like the last light before a storm. Outside, another puff of smoke curled into the sky. This time closer, the marshal's jaw set. "Then we start tonight." He closed the door against the wind, slid the bar into place, and the cabin fell silent. A single flicker of firelight against the dark, holding its breath before the siege to come. The rain hadn't stopped since sundown. It beat against the warped boards of the cabin like 1,000 small hammers, each one marking time before the coming fight. Inside, the air smelled of oil, wet leather, and fear. Marshal Dane Holt moved methodically through the shadows, checking the window seams, the door frame, the line of sight through the rifle slits he'd carved with his knife. His movements were calm, too calm, like a man who'd already accepted what sunrise might bring. Clara Vance stood by the table, lantern light trembling over her hands. Her fingers were slick with gun oil as she fed cartridges into the long rifle one by one. The metallic clicks sounded louder than thunder. Outside, the wind screamed through the canyon, scattering rain like shattered glass. Each gust made the cabin groan, but neither of them looked up. There was no room left for fear now, only work. "Keep it steady," Holt murmured without looking. His voice was gravel, worn thin by nights like this. Clara swallowed, nodded once, and checked the revolver beside her. "I'm steady enough," she said. It wasn't bravado. It was exhaustion turned into iron. He glanced over, just a glance, but saw the tremor she tried to hide. Mud streaked her dress, hair hanging damp against her cheek. She looked nothing like the defiant stranger who'd spat the word Marshal like an insult the night before. She looked human now, raw, bruised, but burning with something deeper than fear. Holt dragged a broken wagon plank across the window and drove a nail through it with the butt of his revolver. The sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. He didn't flinch. "They'll come from the ridge first," he said. "They'll try to smoke us out," Clara nodded. "Then let 'em choke on it." He almost smiled, almost. That kind of grit could only come from someone who'd already lost too much to be afraid of losing more. He opened the deputy's satchel and froze. Inside, under a blood-soaked bandage, lay a revolver with a worn ivory grip. He recognized it instantly, the initials carved along the handle. R.V. Clara saw it too. Her breath caught. "That was my brother's," she whispered. Holt turned it over in his hand, thumb tracing the engraving. For a moment, his reflection shimmered in the steel barrel, a lawman holding the weapon of the man he'd helped kill. A lifetime of duty pressed heavy on his chest. Then, without a word, he offered it to her. "He'd want you to use it right," Holt said quietly. Her eyes glistened, catching the flicker of lantern light. She took the revolver like it was a holy thing, something that could absolve or condemn, depending on how she held it. They worked in silence after that. The cabin transformed, furniture overturned into barricades, barrels rolled against the door, ropes tied to window latches. The lantern flame bent low in the draft, painting them both in shades of gold and shadow. Outside, thunder rolled closer, echoing through the gulch like distant artillery. When Holt finally spoke again, his voice carried something new, something almost like tenderness. "Rain's getting thicker. Mud'll slow their horses." Clara looked up from the floor, a single strand of hair clinging to her cheek. "And what'll slow us?" He met her gaze. "Nothing that matters." The night deepened. The wind howled. Somewhere out there, men were riding through the storm, their torches still dry, their rifles wrapped in oilskin. But inside that small, weather-beaten cabin, two souls who had every reason to hate each other worked shoulder to shoulder, building not just a defense, but a fragile kind of faith. As the lantern flickered and the thunder shook the roof, Clara whispered into the storm, "Let 'em come," and Holt, tightening the last rope across the door, murmured back, "They will." Outside, lightning tore the sky apart, white fire splitting the dark, and the rain poured harder, blurring the world beyond the window. Inside, steel gleamed on wood, boots pressed into wet earth, and hearts beat in unison with the storm. The siege hadn't begun yet, but the war inside them already had. Night on the frontier carries a certain kind of silence, not the calm kind, but the kind that waits to be broken, the kind that tastes of iron and rain. The cabin crouched low against the canyon wind, its windows dim behind nailed boards. Inside, Marshal Dane Holt loaded the last of his cartridges, each click echoing like a clock, counting down to something inevitable. Clara Vance sat by the table, her brother's revolver laid before her. The rain outside whispered against the roof, steady, relentless. Holt paused at the window slit, lantern light glinting off his badge, half hidden under mud and grit. He muttered to himself, "They'll come at first light." But men like Creed, they don't wait for dawn. Almost on cue, faint glows began to bloom across the ridges, lanterns moving in a slow, serpentine crawl through the mist. 10, maybe 12 riders. Holt's hand went to his gun belt, jaw tightening. Clara stood, her dress torn from the day's work, eyes hollow but steady. "Jonas Creed," she said quietly. "He won't stop till he gets me." "Then he'll have to go through me first," Holt replied. The marshal doused the lantern. Darkness took the room. The only light came from the moon bleeding through the storm clouds and the dim coals in the hearth. Both listened, the rain, the distant hooves, the growing pulse of danger drawing near. A shot cracked the night open. The first bullet punched through the window shutter, spraying splinters across the room. Clara ducked. Holt returned fire, muzzle flash searing the dark like lightning in a bottle. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled the air. The gang whooped and hollered outside, their voices bouncing off canyon walls. "Bring her out, Marshal," one of them yelled. "You can't keep the devil's sister hid forever." Holt didn't answer. He crouched behind the overturned table, counting the rhythm of their gunfire. the gaps between bursts. "They're trying to flank," he whispered. Clara's hands shook as she reloaded, but her voice stayed firm. "Then we stop them here." Lightning flashed. For a second the night turned white, revealing the silhouettes of riders circling the cabin. Holt fired twice, dropping one. The thunder rolled right after, swallowing the man's scream. The attack came in waves. Bullets tore through the wooden walls. Smoke and dust choked the room. Holt fired, shifted, fired again. The gang shouted and cursed, trying to rush the door. Clara crawled to the side window and took position. A shadow moved. She fired instinctively. A body fell. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. The revolver bucked again, her brother's gun, kicking smoke that swirled in the lamplight. Outside, Jonas Creed bellowed over the storm. "You think you're protecting her, lawman? That's rich. She's just bait." Always was. Holt leaned against the wall, sweat and rain dripping down his neck. "He's trying to rattle you," he told Clara. She shook her head, teeth clenched. "He's right about one thing. I've been bait my whole life." She glanced toward Holt. But not tonight. A gust of wind slammed the door open, throwing sparks from the hearth. Holt grabbed his rifle, eyes narrowing as the next flash of lightning lit the ridge. Creed himself stepping forward, slick with rain, long coat flapping. Creed's voice carried like thunder. "Marshal Holt, you bury a lot of men in the name of justice. But this one," he pointed at Clara, "this one's blood you can't wash off." Holt stepped into the doorway, revolver low at his hip. "You talk too much, Creed." Creed grinned, lightning revealing the scar that ran down his cheek. "Funny your badge don't shine so bright out here. You're just another killer hiding behind a law book." Clara moved before Holt could stop her. She stepped out into the rain, soaked to the bone, revolver raised. "You shut your damn mouth, Jonas." Creed laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "There's that Vance fire. Shame your brother didn't live long enough to see you aim that thing." He lifted his rifle slowly, mockingly, a heartbeat of silence. Lightning again. Clara fired first. The blast threw sparks off Creed's rifle as he staggered back. Then chaos. The gang opened fire. Holt dragged Clara behind the trough, the world exploding in thunder and flame. Mud splashed. Horses screamed. Bullets hissed like hornets. Holt shot one rider clean out of the saddle. Another charge through the rain, only to meet Holt's rifle butt to the jaw. Clara, breathless and wild-eyed, stood beside him, firing until the revolver clicked empty. Smoke hung low over the cabin yard. The last of Creed's men fled into the storm. Only the leader remained, on his knees, bleeding into the mud. Holt walked toward him slowly, gun steady. Creed coughed blood and grinned. "You think killing me makes you clean?" Holt said nothing. He looked to Clara. "It's your choice." She hesitated. The rain fell harder, washing the blood from her face, from his hands, from the ground itself. Then she shook her head. "No more killing," Creed laughed one last time. "Ain't no end to it, girl. Not out here." A final flash of lightning, a gunshot. Creed fell forward into the mud. The echo rolled through the canyon and faded into the rain. Silence settled, deep and heavy. Holt lowered his weapon. The cabin door swung on its hinges, creaking like a sigh. Smoke curled from the chimney hole. Spent shells glimmered in puddles. Clara looked at Holt through the rain. "You could have stopped me." He holstered his gun. Didn't seem right, too. They stood together in the open yard as dawn began to bleed over the horizon. Gray, then pale gold. The rain softened to a drizzle, steam rising from the wet earth. For the first time in hours, Holt let himself breathe. He looked toward the ridge where the lanterns had first appeared, now empty and still. "That's it," he said quietly. "It's over." Clara shook her head. "Nothing's ever over out here, Marshal." "Not really." He met her eyes, not as lawman and outlaw's kin, but as two souls left standing after the storm. What would you have done, standing in that rain with justice looking you in the eye? As the camera pulls back, the cabin becomes a dark shape against the glowing horizon, smoke drifting like memory. The storm has passed, but the story lingers, of bullets, mercy, and blood washed clean by rain. And over it all, the narrator's voice returns, low and steady. The frontier, don't forget, It just buries its dead beneath new grass and keeps riding on. But sometimes when two hearts survive what should have killed them both, that's enough justice for one night, fade to dawn. Dawn came slow over the canyon, spilling red light across the soaked earth. Smoke curled from the half-burned cabin, rising thin and pale into a sky washed clean by rain. The storm had broken sometime before dawn, leaving the air heavy and quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after something violent has passed. Every plank of that cabin carried bullet holes. Every shadow carried the memory of what happened there. Marshal Dane Holt moved through the wreckage like a man counting ghosts. The rifle still hung from his shoulder, but the edge in his eyes had gone dull. His boots sank deep into the mud as he crouched beside the noose he'd cut down the night before. The same rope that once held Clara's brother. Now it lay half-buried, soaked, the fibers dark with rain and blood. Holt picked it up, ran his thumb along the coarse hemp, and said nothing. Behind him, Clara stood by the doorway, her hair matted and her dress streaked with dirt and powder. She looked like someone who had lived through the end of the world and found herself still breathing. Her brother's boots sat beside her, the last pieces of a man who had been outlaw, victim, and legend all at once. She watched Holt in silence, her face unreadable, her eyes red but steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sure. He wasn't all bad. Just trapped between debts and pride. Holt didn't look up. "Ain't no man out here all bad," he said. "Nor all good." He stood, rope still in hand, and walked to a patch of soft ground beneath a twisted mesquite. Together they dug a shallow grave. No words, no prayers. Just the rhythm of shovels cutting through mud. When it was done, Holt placed the boots atop the mound. And then, after a long pause, he reached into his coat. The badge came off slow. Polished silver turned dull in the morning light. He laid it gently beside the boots, the metal sinking halfway into the wet earth. "Maybe justice ain't written in iron," he said quietly. "Maybe it's written in what we choose to carry, and what we choose to lay down." Clara looked at him then, not as the man who hunted her brother, but as someone who finally understood what it meant to lose everything and still try to stand upright. She reached for his hand, not in love, not in forgiveness, but in understanding, a silent truce between pain and purpose. The sun broke through the fog, turning the wet rope gold where it lay in the mud. The smoke from the cabin drifted east, curling into the light. Holt looked toward the horizon, endless, untamed, and exhaled. "Guess that's the end of it," he said. Clara nodded. "No," she whispered. "That's the start." They turned from the gravesite and walked toward the open land, two silhouettes against the rising sun, leaving behind the rope, the badge, and the ghosts that once ruled the canyon. The wind carried their footprints away. The west moved on,